All right, if you are a farmer, if you are a gardener, if you deal with a lot of plants, then this episode is going to be for you. Join me for episode 12 of the Healthy Reasonings podcast.
Welcome to the Healthy Reasonings podcast with Dr. Andre. You are now listening to your number one source for clear, unfiltered conversations about your health and wellness. Join us every Tuesday for success stories, educational topics, and interviews with wellness experts from around the world. You can listen to this podcast on your computer, phone, or any other electronic device that streams podcasts, or download each episode and listen to it on the go. Let's get started with today's episode.
All right, so I want to remind you all that this podcast is not intended to constitute medical advice for your unique and specific medical condition. If you have a medical condition or concern, please seek advice from your very own physician or medical professional. If you don't have one, find one that you trust and engage them for assistance with your specific medical concern. I'd like to just quickly state that there have been a few people who are well deserving of a shout out on today's episode, one of which is user Faye Brown, who consistently leaves comments. If you would like to be acknowledged, then you should probably leave a comment as well. And specifically in Spotify where possible, because that's where I check the most. And that's the most accessible platform for the minute for people to find the podcast. And we are your number one podcast for clear and unfiltered information about health and wellness. I don't want to waste too much time today talking in terms of preamble. I really would like to spend our time today, though, talking a little bit about something that has managed to get me as close as possible to angry as the listeners of the Healthy Reasonings podcast will ever hear me, I suspect. And it's because it hit a little close to home, and I thought it would be important for me to seize the opportunity to both get some catharsis by releasing some of my pent-up annoyance, and at the same time provide some useful information to our listeners or healthy reasoners. So today we're going to be talking about an incident that I had last week. I was actually in the middle of a fairly important meeting. I would never want to assume that my meetings are more important than anyone else's, but it was important to me. And I got a text from my mom, who would usually be aware that I'm in that meeting, so I found it interesting that she texted anyway. And in the text was a picture of a bottle. And that bottle, the text simply read, "Hi Andre, the gardener would like to use the contents of this bottle on our yard. What do you think?" And I scrolled down as quickly as I could and zoomed in on the image. Now, as usual, the product had a very nice name. Very nice name. I'm going to be so careful with calling names, but suffice it to say that when I read the actual ingredient, the active ingredient within what was essentially a pesticide spray, it was none other than our good friend glyphosate. And before we go into why glyphosate and I have a ongoing, let's use the word love-hate relationship, I want to make it clear that I am not trying to further any specific theories. My job on this podcast is simply to make you aware of the unfiltered information that you require to make decisions about your health and wellness. And as I said earlier, If you are a gardener or somebody who does gardening as a hobby, or if you are a farmer who does agriculture on a more wide scale, you really ought to be listening closely right now. I'm going to choose my words carefully, but probably not too carefully, so you're going to enjoy this episode. So before we talk about glyphosate in particular, I would like to make a few statements. Number one, if you have been listening to the Healthy Reasonings podcast for some time, you will recall that a toxin was given a specific definition by me. And toxin is really any substance that when given or introduced to the body by whatever route will interfere with the body's ability to regulate itself. And things are going to accelerate pretty quickly on the podcast, not just today's episode, but beyond, because if you are listening carefully, you will recognize what I'm about to say is very true. And the statement is this: anything can become a toxin. Any chemical can become a toxin. It's just a matter of dose. And I think that there was a famous scientist who actually made that comment in relationships to the word poison. Because anything can interfere with the body's ability to regulate itself. It's just a matter of the dose, sometimes how it is administered, and so on, the duration of exposure. And so when we talk about toxins, sometimes people are hesitant because they think mainly of the obvious ones: radiation, heavy metals, very strong industrial chemicals, good old poison, like when you watch those old movies or read those old stories, Shakespearean stories about poison being used, or old Roman and Greek mythology. But those story writers and movie script writers all were aware of something, whether they knew it or not, which is that any chemical, any substance in the right dose, or I should say the wrong dose, will act as a toxin, meaning it will interfere with the body's ability to regulate itself. Somebody might say, Dr. Andre, you're being overly dramatic. Come on. Can air be a toxin? Well, actually, yes. Most medical professionals will tell you that if you set up an IV line on a patient, or by whatever means introduce too much air into the body, especially via the bloodstream in this case, you can create a very dangerous phenomenon known as an embolism. Similarly, divers will tell you that if they dive to a specific depth and then ascend too quickly back to the surface, they can get something called the bends, because the concentration of nitrogen in the bloodstream changes and becomes toxic. Somebody might say, well, what about water? Water is pure, it's delicious, it's harmless. Yeah, until you drink too much of it, it is entirely possible to drink too much water, and that interferes with the body's ability to regulate itself as well. Let's use painkillers. I don't need to share too detailed information for us all to be aware that painkillers in excessive doses can be extremely hazardous. So I don't want to belabor that point, but I do want to set a good foundation, an unfiltered foundation for us to make a few observations, because I don't want to be that person who goes on a crusade against a particular chemical or a particular drug or a particular conventional approach. That's not my style. My style is to present the information in a logical way as best as I can and allow you to make your own deductions and make your own decisions. So we've established, therefore, that water and air, seemingly innocuous, harmless compounds, can, in the right circumstances, act as toxins. The same goes for painkillers and other conventional drugs, pharmaceutical drugs, absolutely we hear about the concepts of side effects. All right. And even our nice natural herbs, most of the herbs will have a dose at which they can behave like a toxin. So sometimes you may find that the dose at which something behaves in a toxic way to the body is high, meaning it's almost impossible to reach that dose. Sometimes it's low, and as a result, it's dangerous to have the body exposed to that substance, whatever it may be, because the likelihood of the substance behaving like a toxin increases very quickly after a relatively small dose. Now, I don't pretend that this episode is going to be able to cover all the detailed bases about the chemical or chemicals I will discuss in short order. But what I will say is this: it's entirely possible for a scientific discovery that is made now that in the lab, for example, or in a small subset of people, the findings are that the toxic dose of this substance is very high. There are specific pharmaceutical terms like the LD50, TD50, and that kind of a thing that they use when they're testing lab animals, for example, before moving on to trials with humans to determine whether a drug or substance is safe for human consumption or exposure. And I'm going so slow right now because I know how deep we're about to go with this. And so before we jump to the next level of this discussion, we are going to take a quick break for our usual information that you can't do without. Here we go.
In a world that moves too fast, it's easy to lose touch with what truly matters, your well-being. At Teshuva Wellness, we believe in a return to balance, to healing, to your best self. Our holistic approaches nurture not just your body, but also your soul. Whether you're seeking peace, energy, or a deeper connection, we're here to guide you every step of the way. Our medical experts specialize in holistic treatments for chronic diseases, ranging from autoimmune illnesses to cancer. Our treatments are safe, non-toxic, and effective. Because at Teshuva Wellness, your journey to wellness is our greatest commitment. Visit our website today at teshuvawellnessjae.com or call 1-876-787-8197. That's 1-876-787-8197. Teshuva Wellness. Return to health. Return to your best self.
All right. I hope you've absorbed everything I've said so far. No pun intended. But it's going to be important if you're going to have a firm foundation for what we're going to say next. So we are going to spend a little time today talking about glyphosate. Now, what is glyphosate? I am not going to go beyond a simple little website called Wikipedia. And we're going to read what Wikipedia has to say about glyphosate, because I could read from a textbook, I could read from any other source, but I'm going to read from the random one that I picked, which was Wikipedia. Let's go. Glyphosate is a broad-spectrum systemic herbicide and crop desiccant. It is an organophosphorus compound which acts by inhibiting the plant enzyme, and they name the enzyme there. Essentially, it's EPSP, and it is used to kill weeds, especially annual broadleaf weeds and grasses that compete with crops. Anybody who is listening to this episode can simply jump onto Wikipedia and read the same thing I'm reading. I don't think it's hidden. I think everybody has access. So its herbicidal effectiveness was discovered by, and they named the company and the chemist and the gentleman in 1970. That company brought it to market for agricultural use in 1974 under a specific trade name that we're all quite familiar with. So if you want to know what that trade name is, you go and look at that at the website I'm reading from. And the company's last commercially relevant patent expired in 2000. Scrolling down through a whole lot of pharmaceutical information that I understand, but I wouldn't want to bore you with. And they say next, farmers quickly adopted glyphosate for agricultural weed control, especially after the company that made it introduced glyphosate-resistant crops, enabling farmers to kill weeds without killing their crops. In 2007, glyphosate was the most used herbicide in the United States agricultural sector and the second most used in home and garden, government and industry, and commercial applications. From the late 1970s to 2016, there was a 100-fold increase in the frequency and volume of application of glyphosate-based herbicides worldwide, with further increases expected in the future. Now, I want you to listen closely to this next sentence. It says, glyphosate is absorbed through foliage, meaning, I'm assuming that means primarily the leaves of the plants, and minimally through the roots, and from there it's translocated to growing points. So they're telling us how this thing, this substance, acts on the plants. And they give you a whole background on how it works on inhibiting the enzyme. Then it says it is therefore effective only on actively growing plants and is not effective as a pre-emergent herbicide. Not going to go into too much. Now, this sentence is interesting because you would have heard previous episodes speaking about GMOs, genetically modified organisms. And so crops have been genetically engineered to be tolerant of glyphosate, which allows farmers to use glyphosate as a post-emergent herbicide against weeds. While glyphosate and formulations such as, and they name the formulation, have been approved by regulatory bodies worldwide, concerns about their effects on humans and the environment have persisted. A number of regulatory and scholarly reviews have evaluated the relative toxicity of glyphosate as an herbicide. Then they name two large health organizations, and they were looking at something called pesticide residues. And their conclusion in 2016 was that the use of glyphosate formulations does not necessarily constitute a health risk, and they gave an acceptable daily intake limit of 1 milligram per kilogram of body weight per day for chronic toxicity. Read one last statement and then we can jump right in on the deep end. This statement follows the consensus among national pesticide regulatory agencies and scientific organizations is that labeled uses of glyphosate have demonstrated no evidence of human carcinogenicity, meaning they have not been able to demonstrate evidence that the use of glyphosate is directly linked to the development of cancer in humans. All right, so let's find a nice, comfortable middle ground within which to discuss the only thing that's capable of making Dr. Andre feel annoyed. And that is when ignorance, whether deliberate or otherwise, causes innocent people to be harmed. So, we are talking about a plant that was a plant spray that was developed with the intention of making it easier for farmers to kill weeds without killing their crops. And so the thinking is that they would spray this product. It's going to be a liquid initially, but it will be aerosolized, dispersed into the air. And while spraying this product, the aim would be that the weeds or grass surrounding their desirable crops would be killed, whereas the crops themselves would be unaffected. Nothing is wrong with that, I don't think. I happen to have a lot of farmers who come to see me in office, unfortunately. The usual reason why farmers come to see me in my office is because they have developed cancer. And that's just the honest truth. And having said that, I'll make this point now, which is that when I ask the farmer, why do you feel the need to use pesticides in general? Invariably, they will have been using glyphosate in some iteration. I say, why do you need to do that? And they say, well, Doc, when the ground needs to be cleared of weeds and undesirable grasses and other plants that we don't want, we need to make space for our crops that we want for human consumption to grow comfortably. Now, technically, we could go through and manually weed the field, the agricultural field, but that would require quite a bit of manpower, and it's not cost effective. And so what we find is it's way easier to just spray the property or the ground with, in this case, glyphosate, because immediately, in the words of the Jamaican farmers, it burns up the surrounding grass. Now, what that means is that you have a field which may have already, let's not go there. So you have a field in which you spray the entire field with this spray product. All right, so there are two considerations here. One is that the spray is aerosolized, or at least liquid. And when you spray it, some of it is going to linger in the air for an unspecified duration of time. Two is that having sprayed the ground, you would then expect that some of that chemical would not just stay on the weeds, but it would be deposited on and in the soil. Which then means that when you plant your crops, you'll be planting them in soil that was exposed to this chemical. I don't think I've stepped on any toes so far. I don't intend to. I'm only giving you information. So then the next thing to consider is when the plants are, the desirable crops are being grown, they're going to be grown in that soil which has been sprayed with this compound. That means that when they're trying to extract nutrients from the soil, the potential exists that they could be affected by this chemical compound. I'm not saying anything scientific so far. I'm just giving you food for thought. Here's the next statement. Somebody has to do the spraying, and that somebody is usually the farmer or hired assistants of the farmer. And the expectation for the most part is that someone who is handling this chemical is expected to wear a very detailed list of protective gear, what we call personal protective equipment. The expectation for the most part is that when you're using glyphosate and other pesticides, your skin would not be exposed. You'll be adequately covered. You really ought to be wearing boots, is what I have been told and advised. You should be wearing gloves. You should be wearing protective eyewear. And you should also be wearing some form of a protective device for your airways, be that a mask or a respirator or whatever the case may be. Because naturally, a compound that is capable of immediately burning and destroying unfavorable weeds and grasses, one could easily consider that it would be potentially harmful for humans. So let's assume that all of these protective measures are taken by the farmer or his or her assistants, and the spraying process goes well. I'm reliably advised that sometimes it is necessary to spray the field whilst the desirable crops are growing, again to get rid of any weeds that have come up at that time. What that means, therefore, is that the chemical, in this case glyphosate, it could be another pesticide, would now be in the soil. It would have burnt up the weeds prior to planting, but then another spray application would be done. And at this point, one could easily understand that some of that spray chemical would naturally get onto the crops that we are trying to grow. So what that means again is that we now have several potential points where a plant herbicide, or whatever the fancy word is being used in a commercial application for the most part, but has a potential to have for humans to be exposed to it at several different points. One, when it is being sprayed, it is being sprayed in generally a liquid or a spray form. So there's a potential for inhalation, there's a potential for absorption through the skin. We spoke about all of these different things, ways that toxins get into the body, and also ways they can be cleared. So now we have a farmer who hopefully is taking all the protective measures. We know that that's seldom the case, but let's assume that they do. So then they I don't know the frequency of spraying, but let's assume that they spray while the crops are in growth. At some point, these crops will be harvested, and we are expected to believe that when they are indeed harvested, there will be no residue somehow of glyphosate on them. It's faulty reasoning, but let's follow the logic a little bit further. Let's see where we end up. So the plants are harvested, or the crops are harvested, the fruits, the vegetables, whatever. They're taken to the market, and the consumers happily buy them because the products, clearly, having been sprayed, would then have the pests would not be able to bother them either, because some of these things are pesticides as well. And so we now have a nice environment where the fruits and vegetables come out spotless. They look beautiful. They're not bitten by worms. There are no insects terrorizing them. And they're taken to the market, and you go and you purchase your lovely fruits and vegetables. At this point, one can reasonably assume that there would be residue from the pesticides on these fruits and vegetables. And if you're not careful enough, you are very likely to consume some of that residue. To make matters worse, very good doctors like myself often ask our patients to make juices with our vegetables and fruits, or smoothies or shakes. And so what you're doing there is you are now liquefying a lot of these fruits and vegetables with their attendant glyphosate or other pesticide residues on them. And the next thing you know, you're basically drinking the spray. This is why we advocate largely for our patients, especially patients who are already ill, to have organic, non-GMO produce for use. But that's another story. So let's talk about what happens when glyphosate gets into the body. Now, as far as I am personally aware, I do not know if glyphosate is a compound that the body knows how to effectively detox. I can do my research, and I stand to be corrected, and we can have discussions. You can drop some comments. I'd prefer, and I'd be delighted if you drop comments below, because this needs to be a conversation that is stirred up and continues. But let's assume that these pesticides, my current contention being glyphosate, gets into the body. I don't know of a ready way for the body to clear this compound. I really don't. I remember in medical school we were taught a lot about organophosphate poisoning and the fact that many people would come into the emergency room with that being their exposure to their toxic exposure. Sometimes it was actually deliberate, which is unfortunate, and sometimes it was simply due to inadequate protective measures by a farmer. And so we are left with a situation where somebody is exposed to a pesticide. And the truth is, based on my recollection, the most common organophosphates, we had treatment options to help to reverse some of their effects and hopefully save the patient's life in an acute or what we call a short-term setting. But what about a toxin that the body really doesn't quite know how to get rid of? That there's no clear pathway for detoxification of that toxin. What do you think can happen? We're going to find out right after this break.
Are you enjoying this episode? Remember, we are depending on you to help this podcast grow. Take a moment to leave us a 5-star review in your podcast app. Go ahead. We'll wait. All done? Okay, now share this episode with 5 friends. Thank you.
So time flies when you're having fun. And so this substance gets into your body. If there's no clear way for the body to get rid of it, then as we discussed recently, the body will try to find a way to store it somewhere where it will cause the least amount of damage. What that therefore means is potentially when we are exposed to toxins that the body doesn't know how to get rid of, let's assume that they don't immediately trigger a massive problem because maybe the dose is not too prohibitive. The toxic dose has not been reached, and we spoke about that when we read Wikipedia earlier, where they estimated the toxic dose. Let me see if I still have my notes here. They estimated the toxic dose as being somewhere around, where is it? An acceptable daily intake limit of 1 milligram per kilogram of body weight per day for what they call chronic toxicity. So what they're doing is making allowances for the fact that we're going to be exposed to this thing and setting an acceptable daily intake limit of 1 milligram per kilogram, whatever that turns out to be. Good. So you have this substance in your body, and the likelihood is, as you notice, the prevalence of its use in agriculture has increased so much. They described a 100-fold increase in the frequency between the late 1970s and 2016, with further increases expected in the future. And it brings to mind a study I heard about in the United States where they found that when they tested a population, a small subset of the population, for the presence of glyphosate in their urine, meaning the body trying to get rid of the glyphosate out through the urine, what they found is 60% of that population had more than 60% of that population had elevated levels of glyphosate in their urine above the so-called acceptable dose, again, whatever that may be. And what was striking about that study, as I recall, is not the fact that they had so many people who had high levels coming out in the urine, but the fact that the majority of the people tested were urban dwellers, meaning they dwell in cities. So the likelihood of them being farmers, the likelihood of them being even gardeners was low. The likelihood of them having inhaled or been exposed to glyphosate because there is a farm next door is very low. Which means that urban dwellers who would have been exposed primarily by ingestion of foods with glyphosate residue or pesticide residue had greater than 60% of them had unacceptable levels of glyphosate coming out in the urine. And what that then means is, if that's an urban dweller, what about rural dwellers? What about the farmers themselves? What should we be expecting from them? Well, I'll tell you what I've seen. You can accept it or you cannot. I have been to several workshops around the world. I've been privileged to train with some of the best doctors in the holistic space. And I've been able to hear things that probably I should not repeat, and I probably won't. But I will say this. I was fortunate enough to find out about a substance that assists the body in clearing glyphosate. And I held on to that information tightly, not realizing how critical it was going to be. Because having done that training and having my career having taken me where it has, I have been able to see the following scenario play out several times. I'll tell you how the scenario goes. I'll have a farmer come to see me from the southern area of my island, which is where the majority of the agriculture takes place. There's a parish known as St. Elizabeth, which we describe as a breadbasket of our country. So the majority of farmers will be from there or the adjoining areas. And the farmer comes in and he has been diagnosed with cancer. For those of you who doubt me, for whatever reason, you can visit the teshuvawellnessja.com. And by the time you hear this, there should be videos available with testimonials from at least one of the farmers I've treated. So let's give an arbitrary scenario. This gentleman comes in. He has a huge mass somewhere on his body, a huge lump, which doctors have already tested and told him is cancerous. Now, for whatever reason, I've had a couple of these gentlemen arrive in my office. Fortunately for me, I have been trained in how to test, to see what the body is doing and to determine the likelihood of the presence of a specific toxin in the body. I'm not going to go into details on how I do that. That would be for a different episode. And I usually test them. Now, the first time this happened, the farmer, he lay on the bed, I examined him, I tested him, I said, "Sir, you have very high levels of glyphosate in the body." And his eyes went wide and he said, how do you even know that? How could you know that? And I said, well, it's not about how I know it, it's about, is it true? Because if it is, we need to start acting quickly. And he said, "Doc," I remember this man vividly, the very first gentleman, he said, "Doc, I've been using glyphosate as a part of my agriculture for the past 15 or 20 years. I shuddered and I thought to myself, dare I ask him how he uses it? And I said, well, do you do the spraying yourself? And of course he says yes. I said, do you wear a respirator? Of course he says no. I said, do you wear personal protective like overalls or gloves? Of course he says no. Do you wear a mask? No. Do you even wear a long sleeved shirt? No, I don't, Doc. Do you wear rubber boots? No, I don't, Doc. Do you wear anything to protect your eyes? No, I don't. So he's standing in a mist of this thing, day in, day out, whenever he sprays for the past 15 to 20 years. And what I believe we end up seeing in this scenario is the natural progression of a toxin that the body has not been able to adequately clear or clear at all, but which is not immediately toxic, but becomes toxic over time. And so he comes to see me with this huge mass, in this case in his groin. And I say to him, well, the first thing we need to do here, if we're going to help you to get well, is we're going to have to find a way to reduce the levels of glyphosate in your body so that it can stop acting like a toxin. I want you to listen to how I've chosen my words carefully, because the aim of this podcast is not intended to make any accusations or to bring disrepute to any particular company, industry, or or individual. The aim is to provide you with information that you can use. Now, if you want to listen to it, you do. If you don't want to listen to it, that's fine too. But the fact is that I've seen multiple farmers come in with this issue. And so the question becomes, what do you do? Well, I found out that there is a compound that can be used to naturally and safely bind this the glyphosate and other pesticides, and to transport them safely out into the toilet so that they can do less damage within the body. And so I immediately said to this gentleman, hey, we're going to do two things for you to help you to get well. The first is we're going to put you on this compound. You're going to take it by mouth every day. And then when you do that, you're also going to do some work to help to detoxify the liver in general, so that it frees you up for your body to start healing with less demands on the liver and other detox organs. What do you think happened? Well, I'm still shocked to this day, because this happened, as I recall, in around 2018 or 19. I need to go check his files or watch that video again, because he's very clear in his testimonial. And what happened next was that I told him to come back and see me in 3 weeks. He went home. He was very diligent with everything I told him to do. He came back to see me in 3 weeks, and there was no mass visible. No mass visible. He has a bright smile on his face, and he says, well, doc, the doctors had told me that I need to do chemotherapy, but naturally, if the mass is gone, do I still need to do it? And because I'm a man of integrity, guess what I told this man to do? I said, sir, I think you should go to the hospital and speak with the doctors who diagnosed you and inform them that the mass is no longer visible, and you can hear what they have to say, whether they decide to still let you take the chemotherapy. Well, guess what? He went to the hospital and the doctors said, yes, you must still do the chemotherapy. I'm not necessarily going to have a debate about whether they made the right call, but the fact is they asked him to do that. Now, by this time, his body presumably had reduced its levels of glyphosate, and his liver was getting lots of support. And what happened in response to that is he would do the chemotherapy, and the doctors would give him the long list of expected side effects. And to their surprise and his, not only did he have none of the side effects, but after each chemotherapy session, he would return to his manual labor job, lifting boxes and crates at the farm. And he did about 4 cycles of chemotherapy, and the result was consistently the same. He never ever experienced a side effect, nor did he lose energy or feel unable to do his physical activity that he did day in, day out. And to make matters even more interesting, I think by now at least 5 years have passed. Sorry that I don't have the details at hand, but the website is there. You can check it out. And he's still alive. And unfortunately, what is he still doing? He is still farming. He's still farming. And the truth is, I said to him, are you still using glyphosate? And he said, yes, he is. Now, one of the things I've observed, and there's a need for discussion. What I've observed is that if I speak to the farmers about a specific trademarked brand of glyphosate that was most popular before the patent was lost, then they will sometimes say they don't use that particular brand. But of course, once a patent expired, anybody could theoretically market that drug under a different name. And this is exactly what is happening. Which brings me full circle to what I experienced a week ago and why I had to record this podcast episode. Because when my mom reached out to me and said, hey, the gardener is going to spray this thing, what do you think? When I looked at the brand of the spray the gardener wanted to use, it said something that seemed so helpful and nice and harmless. And I thought, wow, this looks okay. But having had experiences over the years with farmers, I read the fine print and looked at the active ingredients. There was my good friend, the glyphosate, staring at me. So I immediately asked my mom to return the bottle to the whatever store, hardware store, or wherever she had gotten it, and to instruct the gardener that, in fact, he would not be spraying that at my family home on this or any occasion. So I don't just want to skirt around this topic, because it is extremely important for us to understand that something that was, let's say for argument's sake, created or invented, discovered with the greatest of intentions for the furthering of humankind and the benefit of humans, could arguably still be found later on, after several years, to actually be harmful. And we need to be able to speak freely about that and to accept that whether the intentions of the manufacturers were pure and whether they were well-intentioned or not, changes nothing. Anything can be a toxin at the right dose and the right method of administration. And I'm using very guarded words here because we can read between the lines. Anything can be given in a way that it causes the body to be unable to regulate. And it could be something that in clinical trials or in the lab or even for several years of use appeared not to cause any problems. But long-term observations are made that whilst we cannot necessarily link them specifically to the disease that the patient develops, we can see an association. And my small experience in a tiny island of Jamaica, a clinic setting, I'm sure has been seen in several other countries across the world, which is why there are several issues surrounding this particular chemical. Several legal issues are arising, lots of different things happening in that space, which I don't want to necessarily get into, except to say that for those lovely ladies and gentlemen who are into home gardening and flower shows and who has the prettiest orchid or other plant, be very vigilant by looking carefully at what you are using to make your plants grow well and to protect them from pests and to protect them from weeds and other undesirable plants. Look very carefully again and see what you're really using. And my personal thought on this is I wouldn't even bother to go the route of doing the personal protective equipment as a preventative measure, because I still think that we don't have enough information to reliably determine if those things are even helpful against this particular chemical. My advice personally to my patients is if you are using this chemical, you might want to reconsider using it any at all, especially if you are already ill. I met a gentleman who had developed a particular type of cancer, and when I tested him again, he was not a farmer. I tested him and found to my surprise his levels of glyphosate were very high. When I explained this to him, he was able to trace it to a neighbor who did a lot of gardening and as a result did a lot of spraying. And the spray, he would know when his neighbor was spraying and he would try to avoid it, but unfortunately he was unable to. So again, I recommended that he consider trying this compound that helps to remove the glyphosate safely. He did. He also opted to do chemotherapy, just like the previous patient I mentioned. And again, he did the chemotherapy with little or no side effects. The treatment was extremely successful. And to the best of my knowledge and his knowledge right now, there's no residual traces of the cancer. So where do we end today's episode? Well, we end today's episode by looking back at a few points I made. One, anything can potentially be toxic. How many times have I said that today? Anything can potentially be toxic at the right dose or method of administration. Oxygen can be toxic. Air can be toxic depending on how it's administered. Water can be toxic. Nitrogen becomes toxic in divers. I'm going to avoid speaking about the most obvious toxin, but I want you to read between the lines to see what has happened in recent years to us as a globe, and wonder if something that was well-intentioned could actually act as a toxin under the right circumstances. I'm pleased to say that as far as I know, my mom returned the bottle to the hardware store, and she has advised me that this will not be used. She would rather have weeds than to have this substance sprayed. Anyway, I think I've gotten most of that out of my system, no pun intended. I promise you this, I'm going to find a way to get somebody who is closer to the use of these chemicals on this podcast, because I generally try not to step too far out of my lane. My lane is a treatment of disease, and I've found a way to do that. But this chemical in particular tends to be my enemy because it shows up quite a bit too often amongst my cancer patients as a potential contributor to their illness. And certainly when I help them to reduce the levels in the body, I can see where they're getting better. So one can always argue about whether or not it causes cancer or does not. The fact is that when I help my patients to remove it from the body, the patients seem to be getting better. So you can do with that information what you will. I could tell so many other stories, but I actually can't tell one of them because of the reasons I outlined before. It's actually a legal matter at the moment, and I wouldn't want to prejudice any of those discussions. If you're listening to the podcast at this point, thank you for listening to the end. And I want to say that I really appreciate the opportunity to serve in this way. I envision this podcast as an opportunity for me to just be free and unfiltered in my speech. I still try to be responsible because, it's a very interesting world that we live in. But anyway, I hope you've been able to decipher some of what I'm not saying and to make some serious considerations about your health and wellness and decisions surrounding that. I will simply say that if you are a farmer or a gardener, you may want to consider getting in touch with your doctor. Find a doctor who is knowledgeable about these things and see how you can be evaluated to see if any of your medical concerns could be as a result of what I've shared today. Who knows? I'll close with this little parable that I like to tell my patients. 3 men go to a bar. Isn't this funny? That's how all jokes start. 3 men go to a bar. They all 3 order the exact same drink at the exact same time, drink it at the exact same rate. And 5 minutes later, 2 of the 3 men get up quite comfortably, walk out to their cars, which they really ought not to, jump in their cars and drive safely home. And the 3rd gentleman is passed out, stone cold drunk at the bar. I'm going to explain how that works in our next episode. I want to say thank you for listening to the Healthy Reasonings podcast, your #1 podcast for clear, unfiltered information about your health and wellness. It's my pleasure to serve you, and see you at the next episode.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Healthy Reasonings podcast. Remember to subscribe to this podcast so you can be updated as soon as new episodes are ready. If you have a question, send us a voice memo on Spotify or type your questions out in the comments. For more information or to become a sponsor, please check the show notes for our contact information. See you soon.